This is ANAplus, powered by the African News Agency. You're watching Byte, where we give you everything you need to know about Africa now. We've been island hopping over the last few episodes, and today I want to talk about Seychelles. You may think of this idyllic group of about 115 islands in the archipelago as nothing more than a perfect beach holiday destination known for its unusually large coco de mer fruit, the largest nut in the world, and some pretty decent rum distilleries. But there's more to this incredible group of islands than just delicious fresh tropical fruit, divine seafood, coral reefs teeming with life, bats the size of eagles, and hundreds-year-old giant tortoises. The islands are believed to have been uninhabited until their discovery, but as we have learned by now, history and recorded history are two very different things. So the islands had likely been visited and noted by Arab navigators and other seafarers prior to being spotted by the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama. Now, one of the islands was recorded as sighted in 1503, and the British East India Company landed there in 1609. This was the first recorded landing on one of the group of islands. France claimed the islands 150-some years later in 1756. Now, the islands would become the theatre for some of the most dramatic naval battles between the French and the British, while romantic tales of pirates operating legally under certain protections abound. Now, some stories pervade on the islands that when the war on slavery was being waged in the 1800s, British warships and frigates attacked and sunk the ships of slavers, freeing the slaves and housing them on board. But they didn't really want to take the freed slaves back to Britain, and apparently didn't have enough supplies on board to take the slaves back to their homes. So they just dropped them off at the nearest inhabitable island, which happened to be Seychelles. That's the story I heard from the Seychellois, though, who happen to be among the warmest and most hospitable people I've ever met. Now, the Seychellois speak a French-based Creole, developed when the first French settlers arrived with their African, Malay, and Indian slaves in tow. The theory that hundreds of slaves of diverse backgrounds and origins were also dumped on the islands by the British supports the development of the Creole language spoken on the islands to this day. But let's revisit the colonial era. So the French claimed the islands in 1756, and in 1770 the first settlers arrived. It's 15 white men, 8 Africans, and 5 Indians. France has recently suffered massive losses in the 7 Years' War with Britain, losing territories in Canada and elsewhere. So they're really banking on Seychelles as a commercial venture, challenging the Dutch monopoly on spice production and transport. But try as they might, they weren't able to make it work. They just couldn't grow nutmeg and cloves on one of the islands, St. Anne. But they still recognized the value of the group of islands as a strategic supply point en route to and from India. Now, at this point, Seychelles was being governed by France via Mauritius, with the French also settling on Réunion. By 1771, they were still trying to establish a spice garden, growing nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and cinnamon. But a year later, many of the settlers had given up and returned to the largest island of Mahé or had gone back home. British ships were then spotted around the island, and feeling threatened, the French dispatched a tougher leader of the colony from Mauritius to establish better farming and husbandry techniques. Now, the leader didn't have much authority over the settlers, though, and by the time the British warship Orpheus, along with a few more menacing mates, came calling in 1794, the French figured they didn't have the means to defend the flag. They rolled over, capitulating and handing over the territory to the British. Now, remember those famous battles I referred to earlier? Well, during one of them, in September 1801, the British ship Victor was seriously disabled by damage to her rigging, but she was able to maneuver broadside to the French vessel La Flèche and rake her with incessant fire. La Flèche began to sink, and rather than surrender her, her captain ran her aground, torching her before abandoning ship. Now, the opposing commanders met ashore afterwards, and the Englishman warmly congratulated his French counterpart on his courage and skill during the battle. Now, what of those romantic pirates? Well, under the command of Jean-Baptiste de Quincy in 1794, the Seychelles colony acted as a haven for French corsairs. Now, corsairs were basically pirates who carried lettres de marque, which meant they could legally prey on ships belonging to nations who were deemed enemies of the French. 1835 signaled a period of decline for Seychelles as crops started failing because the land was not being properly managed. Settlers started leaving, abandoning their slaves, some of whom had already been freed and others who had been freed off the coast of East Africa and dumped on the islands by the British to fend for themselves. But the workers were smart. They quickly realized that growing coconuts was much easier and more lucrative than growing other crops. Now, this is where the coco de mer comes in. The stuff only grows in Seychelles, and while they are not coconuts, their name comes from the belief that the gigantic nut produced by the tree was a coconut of the sea. Now, because the rotted out shells could be found floating in the open water and landed on islands hundreds of kilometers away, this is where that theory came from. Now, the coco de mer is a truly unique and interesting nut. Its male and female parts are very easily distinguishable, much to the humor of tourists. You can also find symbols of the nut emblazoned on many Seychellois buildings and in logos across the islands. Now, another unique thing about the Seychelles is the Seychelles black parrot, which is only found on the islands. There are also massive fruit bats who cruise the evening skies without fear of predation because there are no large birds of prey. Seychelles is currently a democracy led by President Danny Fora, who has made ocean conservation and the protection of the natural beauty of the islands among his major priorities. Now let us know which African islands you'd like to visit next. This is Newsbite on ANAplus. We make Africa matter.